The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Jake Morrison checked the water levels in the cattle troughs. His ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of some of the harshest but most beautiful land in the territory. The cattle were his life, and every day brought new challenges in keeping them alive in this unforgiving landscape. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. At 32, he had already spent more than half his life working this land. His father had built the ranch from nothing, and Jake had inherited both the property and the determination that came with it. The work was hard, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. As he walked toward the main house, something caught his eye near the eastern fence line. A figure was moving slowly across his property, stumbling occasionally. Jake squinted against the bright sunlight and realized it was a person, and they appeared to be in trouble. He quickly saddled his horse and rode toward the figure. As he got closer, he could see it was a young woman, her clothes torn and dirty. She was Apache, probably in her early 20s, with long black hair that hung loose around her shoulders. Her feet were bare and bleeding, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. The woman noticed him approaching and tried to move faster, but her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. Jake dismounted and approached her slowly, his hands visible and empty. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "You're on my land, but you're safe here." The woman looked up at him with dark eyes that held both fear and defiance. She tried to stand but couldn't manage it. Jake could see that she was exhausted and possibly injured. "Let me help you," he said, extending his hand toward her. She shook her head and spoke in Apache. Jake didn't understand the words, but her tone was clear. She didn't trust him. "I don't speak Apache," Jake said, "but I can see you're hurt. There's a doctor in town who can help you." The woman studied his face for a long moment. Something in his expression must have convinced her that he meant no harm, because she finally nodded and allowed him to help her to her feet. Jake helped her onto his horse and led them both back to the ranch house. The woman swayed in the saddle, clearly fighting to stay conscious. When they reached the house, Jake helped her down and guided her to the porch steps. "Wait here," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'll get you some water and food." Inside the house, Jake filled a pitcher with cool water and gathered some bread and dried meat. When he returned to the porch, the woman was sitting exactly where he had left her, watching the horizon with alert eyes. He handed her a cup of water, which she drank gratefully. When he offered her the food, she hesitated for a moment before accepting it. She ate slowly, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. "What's your name?" Jake asked. The woman looked at him but didn't answer. Jake pointed to himself and said, "Jake." "My name is Jake." After a moment, she pointed to herself and said, "Ayanna." "Ayanna," Jake repeated, and she nodded. Over the next hour, Jake tried to communicate with Ayanna using gestures and the few Apache words he had picked up over the years. He learned that she had been traveling for several days and that she was running from something or someone. Her fear was obvious whenever she looked toward the eastern horizon. As the afternoon wore on, Jake noticed a dust cloud in the distance. Someone was approaching the ranch, and they were coming fast. Ayanna saw it too, and her whole body tensed. She stood up quickly, looking around for a place to hide. "What is it?" Jake asked. "Who's coming?" Ayanna grabbed his arm and spoke rapidly in Apache. Even though he couldn't understand the words, her urgency was unmistakable. Whatever was coming, she was terrified of it. The dust cloud grew larger, and Jake could now make out several riders. They were moving at a full gallop, and something about their approach suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit. "Come on," Jake said, taking Ayanna's hand. "We'll go inside." He led her into the house and positioned himself near the front window where he could see the approaching riders. Ayanna crouched behind the kitchen table, her eyes never leaving the front door. The riders pulled up in front of the house in a cloud of dust and shouting. Jake counted 6 men, all heavily armed. Their leader was a tall man with a thick beard and cold eyes. Jake recognized him immediately, Tom Bradley, a local rancher known for his hatred of Apache people. Bradley dismounted and walked toward the house with his hand resting on his gun. The other men spread out, surrounding the building. "Morrison!" Bradley called out. "We know you've got her in there. Send out the Apache woman, and there won't be any trouble." Jake stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible but ready to draw his own weapon if necessary. "I don't know what you're talking about, Bradley," Jake said calmly. "Don't play games with me," Bradley snarled. "We've been tracking her for 2 days. She killed 3 of my men and stole horses from my ranch." Jake glanced back toward the house, then returned his attention to Bradley. "Even if that were true, what makes you think she's here?" "Her trail leads straight to your property," one of Bradley's men said. "We followed it right to your door." Bradley stepped closer to the porch. "She's a murderer, Morrison. You harboring her makes you just as guilty." "If someone committed a crime, that's a matter for the sheriff," Jake replied. "Not for a lynch mob." Bradley laughed harshly. "The sheriff's 3 days' ride from here, and we're not waiting that long. Justice needs to be swift when it comes to Apache killers." Jake knew that Bradley's version of justice would involve a rope and a tree. He also knew that whatever Ayanna had done, she deserved a fair trial, not the rough justice that Bradley was planning. "You're not welcome on my land," Jake said firmly. "I want you and your men to leave now." Bradley's hand moved closer to his gun. "We're not leaving without her, Morrison. You can hand her over, or we can take her. Either way, she's coming with us." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel the weight of his Colt .45 on his hip, and he knew that Bradley and his men were equally ready for violence. "Think carefully about this, Bradley," Jake said. "You're outnumbered here." Bradley looked around and laughed. 6 against 1? I like those odds." 6 against 2, Jake corrected. "And I know this land better than you do." Inside the house, Ayanna had been listening to the conversation. Even though she couldn't understand all the English words, she could tell that Jake was protecting her. She had expected him to hand her over to Bradley's men. Most white men would have done exactly that. She thought about the events that had led her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been living peacefully with her small band in the mountains. They had been trying to avoid contact with white settlers, living off the land as their ancestors had done for generations. But Bradley's men had found their camp. They had come at dawn, when most of the people were still sleeping. The attack had been sudden and brutal. Women and children had been killed alongside the men. Ayanna had escaped only because she had been gathering water from a nearby stream when the shooting started. She had watched from hiding as Bradley's men burned their camp and took their horses. When one of the attackers had approached the stream where she was hidden, she had been forced to defend herself. In the fight that followed, 3 men had died. Now she was being hunted like an animal, and this white rancher was risking his life to protect her. She couldn't understand why he would do such a thing. In her experience, white men cared nothing for Apache lives. Outside, the confrontation continued. Bradley was growing impatient. "This is your last chance, Morrison," he said. "Hand over the woman, or we'll burn your ranch to the ground." Jake's jaw tightened. "You touch my property, and you'll answer to me." Bradley signaled to his men, who began spreading out even further. It was clear they were preparing for an assault on the house. Jake stepped back toward the door, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "I'm warning you, Bradley. Leave now, or face the consequences." "The only consequences here will be yours," Bradley replied. He drew his gun and pointed it at Jake. "Last chance." Jake's Colt cleared leather faster than Bradley expected. The first shot took Bradley in the shoulder, spinning him around. The rancher's men opened fire immediately, and the peaceful afternoon exploded into violence. Jake dove back into the house as bullets splintered the wood around the doorframe. He rolled to his feet and found Ayanna crouched behind the kitchen table, her eyes wide with fear but determined. "Stay down," he told her, then moved to the window to return fire. The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Bradley's men had numbers on their side, but Jake had the advantage of cover and superior marksmanship. Within minutes, 2 of the attackers were down, and the others were seeking shelter behind their horses and nearby rocks. Bradley, wounded but still fighting, called out orders to his remaining men. They began a coordinated assault on the house, laying down covering fire while others moved to flank the building. Jake realized that his ammunition wouldn't last forever, and Bradley's men would eventually find a way inside. He needed a plan that would end this fight quickly. Ayanna appeared beside him at the window. In her hands was an old rifle she had found leaning against the wall. Jake started to tell her to get back to cover, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't a helpless victim cowering in fear. This was an Apache warrior ready to fight for her life. She spoke to him in Apache, and somehow he understood her meaning even without knowing the words. She was asking him to trust her. Jake nodded and moved to the other window. Together, they laid down a withering fire that forced Bradley's men to take cover. While the attackers were pinned down, Ayanna slipped out the back door of the house. Jake continued firing from the window, making sure that Bradley's attention remained focused on the front of the house. He had no idea what Ayanna was planning, but he trusted that she knew what she was doing. Minutes passed like hours. Jake's ammunition was running low, and he could hear Bradley's men moving around the sides of the house. Soon they would be in position to storm the building from multiple directions. Suddenly, shots rang out from behind Bradley's position. One of his men cried out and fell. The others spun around, confused by this new threat. Ayanna had circled around behind them and was picking them off one by one with deadly accuracy. Her shots came from different positions, making it seem like there were multiple attackers in the rocks and brush behind the ranch. Bradley realized he was caught in a crossfire and ordered his remaining men to retreat. But it was too late. Ayanna's tactical knowledge and Jake's defensive position had turned the tables completely. Within another few minutes, the fight was over. Bradley and one other man were the only survivors, and both were wounded. They limped to their horses and rode away, leaving their dead behind. Jake stepped out onto the porch, his gun still drawn. The silence after the battle was deafening. Smoke drifted from bullet holes in the walls of his house, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Ayanna emerged from the rocks behind the ranch, moving like a ghost across the desert landscape. She approached Jake slowly, the rifle still in her hands. When she reached the porch, she looked at the damage to his house and, then, at Jake himself. She spoke in Apache, her voice soft but intense. Jake didn't understand the words, but he could see the gratitude in her eyes. He also saw something else: respect. She had been testing him during the fight, judging his character and his skills. Apparently, he had passed her evaluation. As they stood there in the aftermath of the battle, both of them realized that something significant had changed. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had fought side by side and survived. A bond had been forged in the crucible of violence, and neither of them would ever be the same. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in deep shades of red and purple. Jake looked at the bodies scattered around his property and knew that this was only the beginning. Bradley would be back, and he would bring more men. The fight for Ayanna's life, and possibly his own, was far from over.